tell me about this article you're working on.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for giving me the opportunity to come on here. I've been down the rabbit hole of the IMF and the World Bank for the last few months. It's pretty dark, I'm not going to lie. I've learned a lot. I've been shocked, appalled, outraged, depressed, and inspired. That's kind of my journey. I think that people in the Bitcoin community at least have this idea that the World Bank and IMF are up to no good. They have this rough idea. Most people, however, don't really know anything about the IMF. They're like, oh, three-letter, acronym, organization, like the UN, whatever. And maybe they assign it as like a neutral in their mind. And a lot of people have positive thoughts about the World Bank. They're like, oh, it like fights poverty in poor countries, right? So in that sense, I think the Bitcoiners are onto something. And in my work over the last few years, I've kind of encountered here or there. I realized that the IMF was involved in like the monetary colonialism in West Africa. I of course had heard about the kind of economic hitman stuff in pop culture, right? I didn't know how seriously to take those accusations. So I decided to just start learning about the IMF and World Bank. And I discovered that there aren't a whole lot of books that cover this topic. It's a little bit buried. So I really had to dig around, go find things that were written in the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s. And in there, you really find some incredible analysis and stuff that really blew me away. For whatever reason, in the last couple decades, people have largely stopped thinking about the World Bank and IMF in a critical way. Like the debate has faded from the discourse. Back in the 90s, there were huge protests. There were tons of books written in 1994, which was the 50th anniversary of the bank and the fund. But I don't know, man. It's like they've faded from our public consciousness. So I hope today's episode can help people reorient them back to the center of our consciousness, which is really where they should be, given their role in the world, what they've done, and what they continue to do.
How closely do they work together? How interlinked are they? Or should we, if we want to explain what they are, should we separate them, explain each individually?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, they are close together. Physically, they're both based in Washington, D.C., which tells you something about who controls them. And the two buildings that they are housed in are connected like Siamese twins with different tunnels and corridors that connect the two buildings so that, for example, people can sit on the board of both institutions. Basically, they're extremely close. The institutions travel to developing countries together. They create reports together. People will be hired at one, move to the other. Traditionally, the bank is headed by an American and the IMF is headed by a European. That's kind of tradition. But in general, the institutions are quite close, but they serve very different roles. So we can get into that. The general idea is that in 44, as listeners of your show probably know by now, the modern financial system was created in New Hampshire at a hotel at Bretton Woods. And two really key parts of the modern financial system are the World Bank and the IMF. Now, originally, they were created to help rebuild Europe and Japan after World War II. That was like the original idea. The bank was a development bank. So the bank was supposed to give out loans to rebuild infrastructure. The IMF was supposed to address balance of payments concerns. So when a country would start to have like basically an exports crisis, like basically when their imports started to become much higher than their exports, and they couldn't pay their invoices, they couldn't import things, they couldn't pay debt back. The IMF existed as an institution to help address that. So originally they had these two kind of very different roles. And in the first decade, they largely focused their funding on Europe and on a handful of like more modernized, industrialized developing countries like Turkey, for example. After like the mid 50s, Europe was like back on its feet and Japan was like crushing it. Okay. These economies were clearly they found their step again and they were leading the world again. So the bank and fund's energies were directed towards the developing world. And that's where we're going to.
So they were created with good intention and relatively successful early on in rebuilding or supporting the rebuild of Europe and Japan.
I think it's fair to say that initially the intention was good. Yes, like they were built to prevent what happened essentially in the 1930s, which was like the world had broken apart. No one trusted each other. There was like competitive currency devaluation. So the bank and the fund were created to create international economic stability. Unfortunately, that is the opposite of what they've done in their history, and that is a result of their actions in the developing world.
And just before we get into the details of this, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, both based in Washington.
Yeah, exactly.
What is the governance structure of these organizations and how are they funded?
Yeah, so basically, like, there are creditors who deposit funds at the bank and the fund. The main 5 creditors historically have been the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. So the former big empires, right?
Yeah.
Today, things changed over time, but historically, the United States has held veto power. So to make big changes at these institutions, you basically needed 85% of the vote, let's say. So the U.S. has always held more than 15%. So the U.S. can like veto any big change by itself. And to do like individual loan decisions, you need like a majority vote. And if you add the U.S.'s vote share with all of its allies, it's more than half. So the U.S. has always been able to like basically control these institutions. And again, like the way it works is that member countries join the fund as a precondition to get access to the bank. So if you want to take out a loan from the World Bank, you have to be part of the IMF. It's kind of like a way they kind of they sort of screwed developing countries. Like the ones that really wanted the loan from the bank had to join the fund.
Okay,
it's a precondition. So every member of the bank is also a member of the fund. And again, the general idea is like you join the fund, you deposit some money in, and then if your country goes into a crisis, you can draw from the pool in different what they call tranches, basically, and at different prices. Like obviously the loans get more expensive the riskier things get.
Right.
So that was the original design. The fund the bank is again a development bank. It's like there will be a specific project, like a hydroelectric dam in a particular country, that the bank will come in and fund. Now, the bank also works very kind of multilaterally. Like the bank will often like lead around with the government in question. Like say it's like Indonesia. So the Indonesian government will throw in some money, the World Bank will throw in some money, and then the World Bank will find a bunch of other people to throw in money. So they often act as like the deal maker for some of these big projects. The IMF is more singular. Like the IMF will come in and just give a big chunk, and then it will kind of disperse the funds as it sees progress in the country. These are called like standby agreements. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like a country would have a crisis, the IMF would come to terms with the government, and then they would have this like agreement, which is basically like a credit line, that the sovereign government would start to draw down that credit line, and the IMF would continue to provide that so long as they saw progress.
But what is progress?
Yeah,
is that specific political goals that they would like to see?
Yeah. So the best way I could put it, and it's I've been struggling to frame it the right way, but basically around the end of the 50s, early 60s, you had two main things happen in the context of our conversation. You had Europe and Japan kind of get back on their feet and become kind of mighty again, right? With their economies, their industries. They recovered from the wreckage of World War II. And then you had decolonization, right? So you had all the empires pulling away from their former colonies. Mm-hmm. 1960s kind of like known as like the end of colonialism, right? Some of the colonial empires fell away in the 50s, some fell away after 1960, but basically 1960s sort of supposed to mark the end of colonialism. So what my thesis is that the World Bank and IMF were created to help stabilize and sort of like, let's say, rebuild Europe and Japan. And once that was done, unfortunately, they were repurposed to extract resources and cheap labor from the developing world.
Like swapping territorial colonialism with financial colonialism.
Yeah, in the same way that when I write about the monetary colonialism in West Africa, the French pulled away politically. Like they no longer controlled, like French West Africa didn't exist anymore. It was like sovereign nations, but they still controlled the money, right? So we went from like political colonialism to economic colonialism. So I guess what I would argue is that post 1960, the bank and the fund allowed the former imperial powers to continue like this colonial dynamic of draining resources from poor countries to support them. And that is, of course, the total opposite of what they say they do.
But is this just down to technical innovation, financial innovation? They're essentially doing the same thing? I mean, political colonialism was really by virtue of being built out of years of ships traveling the world and draining the resources and bringing them back. But we've evolved. We've evolved technologically. You don't actually need to have ships and people there.
Right. So they're strikingly similar to some of the dynamics of like old school mercantilist colonialism, except without the violence. Like the IMF doesn't have guns. So whereas the British or the French or the Americans in the Philippines would go and impose a system where they're like, we're going to take the gold from here. You're going to work and help us get this rubber from over here, and we're going to take it home. And, we're not going to pay you a fair rate, if anything. That was like old school colonialism or like slavery or whatever. This doesn't entail violence. This uses debt as a weapon. So instead of a gun, you're using debt. That's the idea of like what the World Bank and the fund do.
Right. Okay. So just going back to the establishment of the two, originally designed with good intentions.
Yes.
Do you believe their evolution was through malice, or was just kind of like more just a natural way these things tend to evolve, in that the incentive system works that those running the IMF would see a benefit for their own country. Those running the World Bank could see how they could benefit their own country.
Yeah, well, I think that the line between malice and self-interest is blurry, right? Yeah. I think that these institutions were transformed into tools which would benefit the wealthy countries at the expense of the poor ones. I don't think there was like a single meeting where people sat down and said, we're going to perpetuate colonialism. No, I don't think that ever happened. But I do think that this was a conscious shift, and the leaders of the bank and the fund, I think, were quite clear about what they were doing. And the goals over time, I think, became institutional goals. I don't think the average employee of the bank or the fund understands this. There's kind of that like banality of evil thing, right? Like I think they think they're doing a good thing. So I think it's a very high up, very zoomed out process. But as we'll get into, the outcomes of what the bank and fund have done are not arguable. I mean, they're very clear. So it is a fair debate, like, was the destruction that they've wrought intentional or not? That's up for debate. What's not up for debate is the outcome, right? So it is interesting to talk about how much of this was like path dependency, right? Like it just sort of, it was a course that was set, and maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe these wealthy countries realized they needed the bank and the fund to do these things to keep our way of life the way it was. I mean, in many ways, what these institutions do is subsidize a higher quality of life for people in the West at the expense of people in poor countries. I mean, that's kind of what they do, as we'll get into. And maybe that was just a decision that was made,
And no part of it could be that the intention was there to help support these countries, but the design of the loans was such that there was no chance that these...
Knowing how the institutions work, I don't think charity was ever the point. No.
Okay.
I think it was self-interest. Now, whether harm was the goal is not clear. I mean, I don't think that's clear, but they're certainly not altruistic institutions, as we'll get into. And
how much separation is there between the institutions themselves and the kind of power lines of government? I know these institutions are based in DC. I've seen them. I've been to DC. It's incredible. Actually, just wandering around DC, the number of institutions you see is incredible. But how much independence do they have from the government? Mm-hmm. Is there independence? Like, if those working at the World Bank believe they're doing a good thing,
Yeah.
but those higher up, like, what are their incentives? They're not working for a private corporation. They're not going to receive bonuses.
There's not a whole lot of independence. So, for example, in the 50s, people at the Secretary of State level in the United States straight up just vetoed bank and fund projects in the Cold War context. So at least in the early years, there was very little independence. There was a huge dam that I think the bank and the fund wanted to finance in Egypt. And Dulles, who was in the cabinet of the United States, he like sort of vetoed it. And there are a lot of examples of that early on. And to give another example, probably the most important person in either institution in the history of the institutions was Robert McNamara, who was the head of the World Bank in the 1970s. And he kind of transformed the whole way the institutions sort of operate, in my opinion. And if you think about his background, he was the CEO of Ford Motor Company, and then he was the Secretary of Defense of the United States. He sent 500,000 American men to fight in Vietnam. And then he went from there to becoming head of the World Bank. And when he left the World Bank, he joined the board of Royal Dutch Shell. And in the 2000s, the head of the World Bank was Paul Wolfowitz, one of the key architects of the Iraq War. So I think that the national security industry is very, very closely tied with the bank and fund, more than people would like to admit. And I think that the United States government has enormous power over these institutions, but Europeans have big power as well, and so do the Japanese. As I'll explain, the Japanese have essentially used these institutions to sort of loot the resources of Indonesia. So, I mean, I think these great powers have all used these institutions for their benefit, but no one more so than the United States.
Okay, talk about Japan then. Talk to me, what have they done in Indonesia?
Sure. I mean, so I think that in some ways you had Western countries benefit enormously from colonialism, right? I mean, the amount of loot that the British took from India is incalculable, right? And that flow of funds started to slow down first after World War I, and then kind of trickled to a halt almost after World War II. Some say, a lot of people argue, why did we have the Great Depression, right? This is a huge academic argument. And you have the Keynesians and the Austrians, and they argue over, well, is it because we left the gold standard, or is it because we didn't leave it fast enough, right? And that tends to be the Western argument. I think there's another really good argument too that's related to our conversation that a bunch of Marxists put forward, which I actually think is kind of obvious and I agree with. And I think that one of the major factors in the Great Depression is that Western Empire countries lost a massive revenue stream, which was colonialism started to wind down after World War I in a big way. And that makes a lot of sense to me. That would lead to a smaller economy. Yeah. So I think, again, you had this process over time of decolonization. And that was a really big problem for these big industrial countries. They had gotten really cheap goods and services for a long, long time. So when you look at a country like Japan or France or Britain, they kind of tried to use the World Bank and Fund to accomplish the same things, just without sort of violence, right? So in Indonesia, the Japanese would get timber and oil and all kinds of resources for their war machine during World War II and previous to that, and when they say colonized Indonesia. So post independence of these countries, let's say Indonesia is now a free country, right? In the 60s, now Japan can kind of do the same thing just without guns. They can offer loans and have their companies go into Indonesia and take wood and minerals and different goods and services for the benefit of the Japanese economy, not the Indonesian economy. And that's sort of essentially what happened there. And same thing in a lot of Africa and Latin America with respect to the European powers and to America. So basically, each of the major creditors of the bank and the fund kind of perpetuated the resource drain that they had gotten during actual colonialism, they've been able to perpetuate that during through bank and fund policy.